Well, welcome everyone to our professional development session with Cumberland School Department. We've titled this Compassionate School Practices, Fostering Children's Mental Health and Well-Being. We are funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And as I mentioned before, today your microphones will be muted and you'll be able to unmute during both the breakout rooms and the Q&A or discussion portions. But please, if you have any questions throughout the training, do use the chat feature. And during the Q&A sessions, use the raise your hand feature if you'd like your microphone unmuted. We are recording this session and it will be available on the MHTTC website. After the close of the event, we'll send you an email that has the slide presentation, a link to the recording, as well as a link to the evaluation and the quiz that you need to take to get your CEUs for this. If you have any questions whatsoever, you can please email that email address there. And we want to remind you that the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network always uses person-centered, recovery-oriented language. So today, please make sure that when you're speaking, that you're using inclusive language that's accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and we will model that for you as well. We use person-first, free of labels language. I'd like to introduce you to our presenters today. Myself, I'm the Education Coordinator for the New England Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and the Director of Innovation and Research Support for the Center for Educational Improvement. I've been a classroom teacher in elementary and junior high school, and I have been working with Dr. Mason and our other presenter, Kayla, on the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative with Dr. Rachel Santa and Lisa Parker. Our next presenter is Kayla Ferris. She is the Program Assistant for Innovation and Research Support at the Center for Educational Improvement, as well as a child and adolescent therapist. And Kayla today is going to be speaking with us about equity in education. Finally, we have Dr. Christine Mason, who's the Director of the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative for the New England MHTTC, as well as the Executive Director and Founder for the Center for Educational Improvement. And she is a recognized national presenter, author, and researcher on the topics of trauma, mindfulness, and educational leadership. Dr. Mason, I turn it over to you.
Joining us today will be Jill Flanders and Michelle Rivers Murphy. Jill is a consultant with the Center for Educational Improvement, and her specialty area is early childhood education. She's worked a long time as a principal of an elementary school, is retired from that, but also has been a principal mentor. That's where I first met her when I was working with principals in mentoring and with the National Association of Elementary School Principals. Michelle is a co-author of mine, and she is our Associate Director of Heart-Centered Learning. Ingrid Paget and I go back to about 2005 when I was doing some work in DC, and we were working with charter schools, but working on issues related to teachers who came to teach in schools without much preparation. So the alternative teacher prep programs. Ingrid is an amazing person. She is a communication program strategist. She adds the flourishes to what we do. So if you see the polish, that's Ingrid. And we just so appreciate that. Our work and the work we're sharing with you today is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. We work as part of the New England MHTTC with Yale, the Program for Recovery and Community Health, and the Yale Perch Program for Recovery and Community Health partnered with my organization to create the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative to support school-based mental health education.
All right, so first of all, I want to say good morning and thank you for joining us. The CTLC provides technical assistance to school mental health services in the 6 states. So we're what's called Region 1, which includes Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. We like some of those states, and some of those states we're not real fond of right now. We have 3 objectives, things like foster alliances to address the needs of children and youth who have experienced or are at the risk of experiencing significant trauma, provide publicly available free training and technical assistance to elementary and secondary teachers, principals, school psychologists, and other school staff, and accelerate adoption and implementation of mental health evidence-based practices. What I mean by not liking is we don't like the tourists, we like the people in the States. I wanted to clarify that. I said that was sort of unfriendly. So anyways, we want to welcome you here, and we would like, if you have the ability to go up into the right-hand corner of your photo where there's those little dots, and make sure your name and email is there. You'll see something that says rename, and you can put in your name and email. That will help Ingrid in creating our polish for our presentation today. And then the last thing we'd like you to do is to take a poll. So we're wondering how many of you are early birds, how many of you are night owls, and how many of you are considered to be flexible? And when Chris asked me to ask this question, I have to say I wasn't sure what you meant by flexible, because I'll say that I have a flexible thinking, but absolutely not flexible in my body. I do not do well in yoga, although I do continue to try. So if you could take that poll, we'd appreciate it. And please enjoy the rest of the morning.
Okay, we'll give you a little time to provide your answers. We'll look at these in just a minute. And of course, if you think about your students, right? Some of them come to school and they're ready to go. And others, just give them another hour or so, please. So we understand, and we understand that during this last, 6-9 months, it's been particularly hard on everyone. We so appreciate what you're doing. And we know it's such a horrific time. And there's so many changes we're going through day in and day out. You think you've got it straight, one thing's happening, somebody changes their mind, something else happens. It is a very stressful time. So we're sorry we're going through this. We hate it. However, we want to do what we can to help. And we really believe what we're talking about today is critical. There's a strong research base supporting what we're going to be talking about. Working with compassionate schools. And we've seen firsthand the results of the things we'll be sharing with you today. So do we have many responses, or are people still going, Ingrid?
The responses are on screen.
Okay. Oh, for the poll?
Yes.
Oh, I don't see it for some reason. Is my slide stuck?
So 25% of people said they were a night owl. 35% said an early bird, and 40% answered flexible.
Okay, wow. So the 25% of you who are struggling, we'll do what we can to keep this engaging. And hopefully you've got your coffee or tea or whatever it is handy to help you as well. And it's kind of fascinating. I tend to be an early bird, people know that. But when I really need to push through, I can stay up. Or there's sometimes that one movie, right? Just another 20 minutes. So anyway, good to see you. We'll move on. So our objectives today, you'll learn about the model we've developed, the Compassionate School Mental Health Model, how it helps to build resiliency and address student needs. You'll understand more about the model and how it could be applied at your school. You'll understand more about the neurobiology of trauma, stress, and mindfulness. You'll learn how to increase equity in education, and you'll get a chance to review your school's SK results. We'll talk a lot about that, and consider preferences for activities at your schools. So here's the agenda. There's 6 parts. We're almost through the intro, right? Next, headed into looking at the model. Then Dana will talk about neurobiology of trauma, stress, and mindfulness. Kayla's going to present about equity. And then I handle the last 2 parts. So here's our model. 4 quadrants. Start with prevention. And you can think about children who are most at risk for serious behavioral and emotional challenges. What can we do with prevention at home, in the community, in the school? Some of the prevention relates to making sure that teachers and staff at the school have some understanding of mental health concerns and issues. Some of it relates to what we can do with things like policies, procedures, perhaps anti-bullying policies, policies regarding cyberbullying, and making sure that that there's resources, that there's screening, those sorts of activities. The next quadrant to the right, support the child, has to do with what we do once we know that kids have more serious needs. The wraparound services, how we work with community mental health providers. What's our referral process like? What do we do to help students in crises? Then building resiliency. Hopefully, many of you have heard about the importance of resiliency. You've probably experienced it yourself. When something happens, are you able to bounce back? For some people, it takes longer, but there's things we can do in the way we set up the classroom environment, in the way we empower students, and the way we instruct with social emotional learning so that they gain skills. And then finally, the area of protective factors. Some of you may have heard about ACEs. We'll talk about it more later. And the fact that one nurturing adult can make a world of a difference for children. As you know, in many families, including many of our families, we've had adults who just aren't able to be that protective factor for one reason or another. And that makes it really difficult, particularly in the children's early years. However, if children can come to school and count on a teacher or see a teacher even online who's nurturing and empowering, a teacher who will listen, that makes a huge difference. The work we're talking about is also based on my center's work with something called heart-centered learning. Michelle and I have been working, writing about, talking about heart-centered learning for probably 7 or 8 years now. This work is supported by research we've done with focus groups and panels of elementary school principals in particularly elementary and middle school. Can't leave out the middle school teachers and principals as well. If you start at the bottom, there are 5 steps. We believe that rather than having, 180, 200 criteria for social emotional learning, where you want to make sure that students meet these standards at various levels, we think that is good, but it's confusing. It isn't simple enough for people to keep it in the back of their mind and for us to go deep enough to build the strengths that are needed. On the other hand, with heart-centered learning, we've got 5 C's. It begins with consciousness or awareness, mindfulness. With that, you're aware of yourself, your feelings, your emotions. You're aware of people around you. What are they feeling? Are they having a good day or bad day? How's that impacting what's going on? And you're aware of the environment. So what's happening around us? How does that influence what children bring to the learning situation? Without consciousness, it's really hard to have the other parts of this model put together. To develop compassion, you first have to be aware. And we know for some students, for some people, this is really hard. Sometimes when people have gone through hardships, there are barriers to compassion, and they'll resist it. They think it may be being a wimp, or that somebody's going to take advantage of you. Or frankly, they may have never even really thought about it because they're so busy trying to keep their own lives together. So compassion, we know, is critical. Compassion and empathy. When students have experiences with these over a period of time, they'll start to develop confidence. Confidence in their ability to recognize their own emotions. Confidence in their ability to express compassion and empathy. Also, if we think about student self-esteem, resourcefulness, and ability to use what we practice in the classroom, that takes some confidence, that takes practice. And with practice, you can get more success. Once students have had success, then the courage is easier. You know, it's a little easier to stand up to a bully if you've had some practice on what to do in these circumstances. It's a little easier to take those bold steps for yourself, to do something that's going to take you from one position that may not be too healthy, may not be too good for you, and to move elsewhere. So courage is critical. These together can lead to compassionate action. However, it all happens inside of a community. You know, you've probably heard this with the internet right now. Connection is so important. If you're like me, sometimes I get on these Zoom calls and I'll see someone I know, and it's just good to see them, right? And there are times where I've heard teachers and therapists say that some students even are responding better to therapy online than in person. So that connection is important. What do we do to build that sense of belonging and community? If our 5 steps for heart-centered learning happen inside of a compassionate, heart-centered community, then we teach people how to build a community so that they can go out beyond our boundaries and build their own communities with their families and their neighbors, friends, that will reflect the values we have. So here's one of these exercises. Okay, get your paper and pencil ready. We're going to give you a couple minutes to look at each quadrant, reflect on your strengths. You can write a few things down, put a plus by the strengths. If it's a weakness, a minus. And if it's like neutral, but you know it's something you do, but you're not sure the impact, you can put a 0. Okay, so we'll just give you a couple minutes. And Dana, this is where we could play music if we had it. Or Rachel, could you sing for us?
No. No. Not this morning. Allergies affect the voice.
Okay, later. In case you don't know, we've got a singer in our midst. If, as you look at these, there's something you just feel so good about that you'd like to share out, please write a note in the chat box as well. Okay, at this point in the presentation, we're going to share with you results from SCATE. The information below, www.scate.org, can take you directly to the instrument that we'll be talking about. Some of you have taken SCATE and others of you have not. So I want to make sure we have some background. Can you go to the next slide? This is the school compassionate culture analytic tool for educators. It takes about 12 to 15 minutes to take it online. Teachers, other staff in schools, administrators, assistants in schools can take SCATE, and you rate yourself, your students, and leadership according to 4 levels. It's a Likert scale, from needs improvement to exemplary. We like to remind people that many times when, in fact, you take these sorts of instruments, you may think you're aiming for proficiency. You may think that that's most critical. However, you have to remember that when we're thinking about children with the most challenging needs, it's important to aim for exemplary, because you don't want to leave out the 1 or 2 or 3 students who most need these supports. So I'm just going to read a couple of these to you. So one example of a question is, students show empathy for others. And then there's one that kind of reflects your own self. I'm aware of my own prejudice and biases and how these might affect teaching and instruction. So again, you can go to SCATE if you haven't taken it. You can actually, there's a demo. So without really signing in and going through the whole official process, you can get an idea of these questions. Okay. So SCATE has 5 factors. These were developed through a national validation study with over 800 participants. So one of the things that's really good about SCATE compared to some of the other school climate measures is that this has been validated. The validation led to 5 factors. And these are roughly comparable to the 5 C's with heart-centered learning. So there's a factor related to leadership. And if you look across, you'll see your results for Cumberland versus the national. And if you glance at all the factors, you'll see that your district actually, when you last took SCATE, ended up being ahead of the national sample. So, all right, that's really good to see. You'll notice a couple other things. You notice the areas of strength in green. And remember, for your level 3, that's proficient. So you're really at a fairly high level in those 2 areas. You'll notice the lowest levels are kind of in that faded peachy color. So conscious awareness of emotions and stress, which has to do with the neurobiology of trauma and mindfulness, those sorts of things, is rated low. And that typically happens, and we're not too surprised, because these are things that teachers and other school staff typically don't learn much about. The other area that's rated lowest for your school district is the understanding of equity. You're at 2.39. But not far behind was understanding courage and resiliency. So 1 out of the 8 schools we're working with today, or 7 schools, had courage and resiliency as its second lowest score. All the others, though, had understanding of equity as the second lowest. So we're going to spend more time on these 2 factors later today. When you get your data, you will have filters available, and you can look at the data by position. So you notice most of the people that responded were general educators. Next highest group was special educators. Specialists was the 3rd highest. You can look by gender, and you'll see that in some areas it's pretty equal, like confidence and positivity and leadership. But in other areas, males tend to rate their opinion of what's happening with school climate at a higher level. We also can look at the data by race. And you'll notice that the white or Caucasian is the blue, the black is the orange, and Native American is green. What can we see off just by looking at this quickly? One of the things that stands out is that in some areas, groups other than white really are rating things higher. Confidence and positivity, factor 4, is a prime example of that. If you look at understanding of equity, Blacks or African American respondents rated as higher than others. We'll talk about that a little more when Kayla talks about equity.
Thanks, Chris. And so now we'll get to talk a little bit about what we rate in factor 2. We're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences, trauma, and mental health. So just to set the stage, we know that mental illnesses are on the rise, and especially with young people. We know that there has been a large rise in mental health challenges due to a variety of factors, including social media and bullying, but also some systemic factors like violence, poverty, and discrimination. And here is just some results from a study from a survey in 2019. And you can see that anxiety and depression are a major problem according to young people. Bullying and drug addiction, drinking alcohol, also extremely large problems, but anxiety and depression was the problem most reported. And that was before the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that since the pandemic, the mental health concerns have risen significantly. A recent poll, 53% of high school students say they are moderately, very, or extremely worried about their mental health. 62% have stress, 51% anxiety, 33% depression, and 24% know someone with suicidal thoughts. And we are aware that Rhode Island has been taking a lot of steps to try to address suicide in youth. We know about the great success that your mobile crisis teams have had. And we know that Cumberland as a district has struggled with some really difficult situations and has put together their own crisis response team. And that's really important, and we applaud you for that. And we do need to talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. In addition to the mental health concerns that the pandemic has brought on, many of our children are also living with additional stressors related to trauma and abuse. This could be sexual or physical or emotional abuse, neglect, parental mental illness, substance use, divorce, domestic violence, incarceration, and a variety of other life events. All are categorized as ACEs. And the literature says that about 60% of us in America have had at least one adverse childhood experience. And I know that at the high school, you all took the ACEs test to get more in touch with your own adverse childhood experiences. And that can be a powerful tool for staff members, but we don't really know how many ACEs our students come to school with each day. But we do know that about a quarter of children experience these before the age of 4, and 60% before they leave school. And like we mentioned, some of these are systemic problems, but others are very individual. And so we never know what a child is carrying with them to school. Some liken it to a backpack. We don't know how heavy that child's backpack is, all the things that they're carrying with them all day that they never get to put down. And this trauma affects not just the cognitive development, which is going to affect academics, but also the emotional development, which is going to affect their social interactions with both other students and teachers and administrators as well. And then if the trauma is not addressed, we do know that it can lead not only to behavioral and mental health disorders, but also risk-taking behaviors that can become very heightened during those middle and high school years. And all of this can add up to educational failure, including dropping out of school, and also violence. We know that children want more than anything a sense of community, and if they're not finding that in their homes or their schools, they can resort to other groups that might include violence. And when we don't intervene, these really large consequences make it all the way into adulthood. And one thing that really exacerbates this trauma and stress is stigma. In many, many communities, we don't talk about mental health issues. And when we do talk about it, we talk about them with a little bit of fear or negativity, shaming. And this can be dependent on certain cultures, sometimes certain religious cultures or ethnic cultures might have a different opinion about mental health issues than others. Different schools have a different culture around the stigma related to trauma and stress. And when that stigma exists, it can really discourage people from seeking out support. Labeling is also a concern with mental health issues. Sometimes when we do the screening and we give children a diagnosis, that label can follow them throughout their career and lead to a teacher making assumptions before they even meet a child. So when we talk about mental health, we like to address the entire school population. As we mentioned before, a great number of children are going to experience mental health issues. So we believe that teaching all students about these topics is important rather than singling out people, focusing all of our energy on singling out people using labels. So let's talk about toxic stress first. And I have a poll for you. I'm wondering about your own sense of stress. What is your typical level of stress on a normal work week? So we have a few options here. Do you have no stress? You're totally calm. A little bit, but it's manageable. Medium, stressful moments, but not all the time. Or are you pretty stressed? Not every single day, but often. or extremely stressed and you're having trouble managing it. I'm seeing the numbers come in. Bravo to those 5 people who have no stress whatsoever. Looks like we have a handful of people who have a little bit of stress. The votes are still coming in, but the percentages are staying steady. We have about a quarter of you who have a medium amount of stress, up to a third now. Okay, and Ingrid, could we share these results? So about 42% of you are pretty stressed. Well, I'm glad that we're at pretty stressed, more than extremely stressed, but that 12% of you who are having trouble managing, you're not alone. We know that teaching is an extremely stressful job. In fact, teachers from an American Federation of Teachers survey from 2017, we learned that compared to the general population, which reports being stressed always or often about 30% of the time, teachers, they report 61% of the time their job is always or often stressful. So even though this stress is not new, we're really feeling it right now. And we have to remember that stress is not just something that we feel mentally in our heads. It's also something that we feel emotionally and that we feel physically in our bodies. Our bodies like to get to this state called homeostasis, where everything is balanced and stable, but stress disrupts that. And there are different types of stress as well. Acute stress is something that happens in the moment. A stressful event occurs and we feel that right then. Versus chronic stress, which means we're being put in these stressful situations repeatedly so that the stress is happening over and over and over again. And that can also be called toxic stress, when it's just constant and your body never has a chance to recover from it. And that toxic stress is where we get into the dangerous stress that can really affect us long term. Right now, we're experiencing a lot of the immediate stress of COVID-19, but many groups of people have historical stress that's tied to intergenerational trauma. And Kayla is going to get more in depth on that later today. But we do need to recognize that different groups of people experience different levels of stress. It's very tied to socioeconomic status as well. When I was in graduate school, I worked in a lab that studied the effect of poverty on stress, and the results are very, very clear. The lower your socioeconomic status is, the higher level of stress you typically have. And we just want to really make sure that we understand that there is a difference between stress and trauma, and that traumatic experiences are stressful, but stressful things are not always traumatic. Trauma almost always is harmful. However, if you have great stress coping skills, you might be able to process that trauma without it affecting you long term. But stress can actually be really positive for us, and our body likes stress in small, acute ways because it can help motivate us. But trauma, we don't really want to encourage any of that. But we do want to have really healthy coping skills for stress. So let's talk about what we saw in New England educators right after COVID-19 hit. We had some focus groups with lots of different educators around New England, most of whom were our fellows in the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative. And we asked them what stressors they were seeing that were unique to COVID-19. The number one that we saw was that people were worried about the students who were most vulnerable and whether they had clothing, food, and safety. And having that lack of connection, that face-to-face time with both other educators, students, and their families really was difficult for people. There was also guidance that either didn't come or was conflicting or confusing from both the district or the state level, and we're definitely hearing echoes of that right now as school was reopening. There was also a lot of confusion about the telehealth delivery of mental health and special education services, whether it was about privacy or legality. Those were a lot of questions. There was also an enormous amount of change that was really difficult. And we had principals who had such increased responsibility and workload that they were working 20 hours a day. And we do know that special education and mental health services specifically had a lot of information. Just the volume of information was really difficult to manage. So thinking back to either the beginning of COVID-19 or the opening of schools, what do you feel was the biggest educator stressor in Cumberland School Department? And if you'd like to share that in the chat, go ahead and do that. Sometimes we did hear from our focus groups that sometimes just naming it out loud can be really powerful. So you can read about this in the report that's linked at the bottom of this slide when you get the slideshow. But we did ask the teachers too, after we had spent about a year teaching them about self-care and stress reduction techniques, we were wondering which of those techniques they were using for themselves. And it was a lot of the things that we had talked about and some other really innovative things as well. But connecting with people was really important, and we were mostly doing that virtually back in May when we did this focus group. Having routines and schedules was very important, especially giving those boundaries of still working the normal work hours as often as possible. Mindfulness, including meditation, breath work, and yoga was really important to our educators. And getting outdoors for movement, but also just riding around in the car. Exercising was really important. And then starting a new project, things like gardening, baking, or home improvement were really helpful. And another extremely important thing for some of our participants were therapy sessions. Even the educators who are giving counseling sessions to their students sometimes can forget that they themselves might also benefit from some therapy. So we do know that the way that we react to stress really does affect us. And if we use those healthy coping mechanisms, that can prevent the long-term effects of stress. Because we know it not only affects how we act and how we interact with others, stress also affects how we think and how we feel about ourselves and others. And it has really, really large impacts on our bodies and our health. So there are two types of coping. There's the dysfunctional coping that some of us tend to go to because we just don't know any other way. And those include abuse of others or ourselves, using poor communication, increasing spending or substance abuse, not showing up, just disappearing. Adultification of children, which means treating children like they're adults, forgetting that they are still youth. Denying, using anger, blame, or avoidance. Those are the things we want to move away from, and we want to move towards functional coping skills, including thinking about the source of the stress. Where is that, and what steps can you take to change that? Can you change your environment? Can you change the amount of time you're spending on that? Can you change how you're doing something? Seeking support, getting help from others. Again, coming back to that exercise, introducing some kind of distraction to get you off that loop of thinking, using mindfulness, including mindfulness-based stress reduction. Cognitive behavioral therapy techniques are really powerful for reducing stress. Accepting something about what's stressing us out, accepting the things we can't change. And then one of the most important is finding that connection with someone who cares. So we're going to do a little de-stressor right now all together. This is a really simple breath work, practice that you can use anytime. I like to tell people that this is the perfect one for those stressful meetings where your boss just took your idea and presented it as their own, and you're really a little upset. You can do this without anyone knowing. You just take your mouth and form a little smile, a slight smile, and then you breathe in through your nose, counting up to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you hold it to count to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the while smiling. And then you let it out of your mouth, counting down from 4. 4, 3, 2, 1. And you keep that breath held out, down from 4. 4, 3, 2, 1. And you repeat it as many times as you need to come back to the present moment and feel calm again. And you can introduce this to students. And if you do, you can add a little motion. It's called square breathing. So we make a square with our finger. As we breathe in through our nose, counting up through 4, we go up. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Release the breath through the mouth. 4, 3, 2, 1. And hold it. 4, 3, 2, 1. And you can keep going on that square as many times as it takes to calm down and come back to that center. So let's come into the importance of connection. We know, as Dr. Mason mentioned, that having a connection with a caring, nurturing adult can be an extremely important buffer to trauma. Research actually shows that this one thing can be the difference between a child's trauma negatively impacting their development or becoming the root of strength born out of resilience. And the way that this relationship works is through reducing stress for the student, helping them build positive relationship skills, and strengthening life skills. So this is our model that Dr. Mason introduced, the compassionate school mental health model. And that compassionate connection runs through each of the 4 quadrants. We hope that we can help educators develop these relationships at the home, community, and school level, working together to educate adults in each environment on the practices that help them form those connections. We also know that when we have those connections, it makes it easier for us to identify the students who do need that extra support, the students who need to be referred for a small group or one-on-one individual counseling. We also know that when we form these compassionate connections, it's easier to help students build their SEL skill set. We can teach them social emotional learning skills during that time that we're spending together, deepening that compassionate connection. And empowering those nurturing adults develops that protective factor. And those nurturing adults help build the compassionate environments that are going to cultivate compassionate school communities. Now, many of us are teaching online, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a chance to connect virtually. We can create these really strong homeschool connections through a variety of ideas, like going on social media to have chats or a little Facebook Live video. We can also use telehealth and mental health support options to deliver services. We can use online programs to teach self-regulation and stress coping skills. And we can cultivate those compassionate relationships virtually or via the phone as well. So let's look at the neuroscience of all of this. Our entire model is informed by neuroscience research at every step of the way. So we know that trauma affects cognitive, academic, and social emotional behavioral domains. And as you are all educators, you're probably really interested in how it affects educational outcomes. We know that trauma really does affect the executive functioning skills in the brain, which can lead to not only mental health problems, but also behavior problems that show up in the classroom. And this combination of the lower executive functioning skills and the behavioral problems can become a cycle that leads to lower academic performance. We know that students who have experienced trauma have a more difficult time graduating and also moving on to the next grade. And these academic gaps actually get bigger as we move across elementary school. So the central nervous system is how all of these things happen. We know that trauma is something that is too much, too fast, or too soon for the central nervous system to handle. And that affects the central nervous system profoundly, including students who have experienced trauma typically have a smaller prefrontal cortex, which is where that difficulty with executive functioning comes in. They also can have an overstimulated amygdala, which means that their fight, flight, or freeze response has a hair trigger. They might be set off by something that they perceive as dangerous that's actually not. For example, if students are in line and one student accidentally bumps into another, if that child has experienced trauma, they may turn around and punch that student in the face, not because they're trying to be mean or vicious, but just because their amygdala is reacting instinctively. Trauma also can result in an underactive hippocampus, which impairs memory functioning, making it more difficult to pay attention and retain information in class. And trauma disrupts the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is this really important nerve that goes all the way from the back of the brainstem and wraps around each major organ. And its whole job is to bring that homeostasis, that balanced state, to our entire central nervous system. It's kind of the control panel for our nervous system. And children who have experienced trauma, they have a harder time regulating that vagus nerve. But luckily, we have a vast amount of research, neuroscience research, that shows us that yoga, breathwork, and meditation all also affect the central nervous system. Mindfulness practices can lead to increased executive functioning skills, and we see this effect even greater for students who already are affected. So the students who have experienced trauma benefit even more from yoga, breathwork, and meditation. This can also result in a more regulated amygdala, a more functional hippocampus, and a more regulated vagus nerve. So where might you be seeing trauma in the classroom? We know that some of the ADHD disorders might be linked, also some fear, anger, or sadness, depression, alienation, isolation, and at the most extreme levels, maybe dissociation, hallucinations, and psychosis or withdrawal. But we know that the majority of what you're going to see is those behavior problems, like we talked about, the hair trigger amygdala. And as we mentioned, we can have dropping out of school, but also that stress and trauma can weaken the immune system, causing physical health problems, including obesity, cardiovascular issues, cancer, and even premature death, and the most tragic, teen suicide. Luckily, we have a lot of what we call evidence-based practices that we can use to address this trauma and stress. The first thing that we know that administrators and schools can do is to support and empower teachers. And luckily, Cumberland School Department is doing that right now by providing you all with this training. We know that especially now in COVID, when so many students and teachers are experiencing stress and trauma, that a lot of the times our classroom teachers are going to be our first supports for mental health. And so getting educated about the ways to address mental health can be really, really powerful. At the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative, we like to focus on student strengths. SCATE looks not only at which factors you need to improve, but also where you're doing well. And we want you to leverage those strengths for your school, and then do the same thing for your students. Get to know them so that you can understand not only their interests, but what they're good at. And look at the school policies, because as we mentioned before, that labeling can sometimes be stigmatizing, but even academic tracking sometimes looks more at the deficits than the strengths of students. So examine how you're doing that and how we could be more strengths-based. We also want to make sure that we're using creative and critical thinking with students. All students have the capability to think creatively and critically, and we just need to teach them the skills to be able to access those. And using that type of thinking is going to help boost executive functioning skills as well. And one of the really important things, which I'll talk about later, is to actually teach students how the brain works so that they can cultivate a growth mindset. It's really, really important that we teach all students social and emotional skills. Even many adults need a little refresher on social emotional skills. So here are a few examples. You can have writing activities where students just share how they feel. You can have them reflect on self-control. You could give them some scenarios and ask them to analyze characters' emotions, or do this during read-alouds or book discussions of chapter books. And you can ask them to figure out ways to reduce their own stress after you've taught them a few strategies as well. And one way that we feel is really, really important in addressing stress and trauma, the research really shows that mindfulness is one of the most effective tools for this. And in this presentation, you'll get a few resources, including a short mindful moments video that you can share with families to help them cultivate some mindful habits back at home. And we also had a discussion with the mindfulness coordinator at Montgomery County Schools in Maryland. That's one of the largest school districts in the country, and they've been using a district-wide approach to mindfulness that's been really, really positive. And here's some more evidence of mindfulness helping students in Houston. They had a program that used yoga and breathing to teach stress relief, and all 26 campuses saw the same results: fewer behavioral issues, increased focus, and a culture of care and compassion. And that's what we're really trying to build here in Cumberland, is that culture of compassion. And one of the really great ways to do that is to teach students and teachers. Right now, all of you teachers are learning about this, but please, we want you to not just hold on to this information, but to take this back into your teaching. It's extremely powerful to teach children how the brain works. Dr. Carol Dweck did a lot of research on growth and fixed mindset, and she found that the simple act of sharing a very short article it's called "You Can Grow Your Intelligence." You can Google it right now and find it. Just having children read that article or explaining the concepts in that article helps them understand how their brains worked and helped motivate them to take more responsibility of their learning. So it's important for all of you and your students to understand this idea of neuroplasticity. It's a big word, but it basically just means that the brain is like plastic. It can change. And those first few years, 0 to 5, are when it's easiest to change the brain. But it doesn't stop there. All the way up until adulthood, the brain is still pretty plastic. And we know that even once we become adults, we can still change the structures in our brains. We know that any skill can be improved by practicing repeatedly, but you have to make sure that you have the resources that you need so that you're doing it the right way, and having the support, especially of caring adults, is really important. And then students themselves have to put in the effort. This is really the foundation of growth mindset. And this is as far as we're going to go into growth mindset today, but it's a really powerful concept that I encourage you to explore on your own. There are very specific ways of providing feedback around growth mindset that can really help build that in both yourself and your students. And the research shows that having a growth mindset can enhance motivation, especially motivation to learn. It can increase self-esteem and in certain cases lead to improved academics. And we know that having a compassionate response where we do understand how the brain works can help us cultivate growth mindsets. And then all of this that we've talked about helps a school become more trauma skilled, but this is not the end of it. This was a very short 45-minute presentation about the neurobiology of trauma and stress. There is so much more information out there, and it's more than just learning about how the brain works and how trauma affects it and how mindfulness and other stress coping skills can help repair the brain. It's about using that information to change the way you respond to students in your classroom. And it's not just about the 460 people here, it's about every single staff member at Cumberland School Department, from the bus driver that picks that child up in the morning, to the principal that greets them at the door, to the cafeteria worker that puts their breakfast on the plate, to the teacher that says hello when they walk through the classroom, the lunch monitor. Every single staff member needs to have this information and be on the same page that when students show us a behavioral reaction that stems from trauma, instead of reacting punitively, we react with our heart. We respond with compassion and understanding of what they're going through, where that comes from, and the best practices to help them soothe their stress and build resiliency. So I really thank you all for listening, and I know that you're going to learn so much about equity in education from Kayla, and we'll save the questions for a little later, but if you have any questions for me in the chat, please do send those and I'll answer them.
Awesome. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears just a bit, but it's definitely all tied together, and talk about equity in education and disparities in mental health. So if we could go to the next slide. So while overall occurrences of things like anxiety, depression, mental illness are relatively evenly distributed across different populations, access to quality care and treatment is not, and this drastically impacts education and schooling. So before we get into the data, I'd like to do a quick exercise. So if everyone can grab their piece of paper and their pen, that would be great. So I'm gonna just give us like 30 seconds or so to think about, what do you like about being white or a person of color? And go ahead and actually write some things down. What do you like about being white or a person of color? Okay, so usually we'd have some more time for that, but keep thinking about that. So whatever you've written down now, I'd like you to cross out anything that involves comparing yourself to other groups. Cross out anything that involves comparing yourself to other groups. Cross out anything that uses a variant of the word racist. And cross out anything that involves defining yourself by what you're not. So cross out anything that involves comparison to other groups, anything that uses or the idea of the word racist, and anything that involves defining yourself by what you're not. And I'd love to see in the chat, how many lines do people have left? You can just give me a number. So if you have, go ahead and count. If you have 1 line, if you have 0 lines, if you have 8 lines, 2, okay, 1, 0, none. Awesome. And obviously we just took a little bit of time, but the numbers that we're getting, kind of the 0, 1, 2 range, that's pretty common. I find, or this exercise often finds that, especially for white people, they'll have a score of 0 or a 1 left. And that's because we don't typically spend a lot of time learning about white middle-class American culture. And in some ways, that's kind of on purpose, right? So it's important to recognize that white American culture is the thing that everything else is normed against. It's made to be kind of invisible and normal in a way that makes everything else then different, right? So a great example of this might be family structure, or at what point young adults leave the house, or in the classroom, it might be kind of how students typically interact, or they should interact, right? So if we come in thinking that some things are normal and everything else is different, then that impacts how we interact with our students and the families and how we think about them. So if it's culturally normal to show you're listening by sitting quietly and sitting still, what does it mean for those where it's normative and even respectful to show you're paying attention by verbally following along and kind of making noises, right? And being more animated. It's so important that we take time to recognize what the unspoken rules are of our culture and how we grow up, so that we aren't bringing those unspoken rules and then the consequences for breaking those rules into the classroom without recognizing we're doing so. And yeah, definitely take a stretch or anything if you need it along the way. So the American Psychiatric Association reports that African American children are 1.5 times more likely to have unmet mental health needs compared to white children, while Latinx children are 3 times as likely to have unmet mental health needs. And data from 2006 to 2012 shows that while African American and white children had similar inpatient and emergency department utilization, Black children had 37% fewer visits to psychiatrists and 47% fewer visits to any mental health professional when compared to white children. And that holds true for most minority racial groups. And so this means that we are seeing kids when they are in crisis at about the same rates, but we're not really seeing them before the crisis point in the same way. And this is important for you folks in education, because these are the kids in your schools and in your classrooms every day, right? The ones who might not be in crisis, but are suffering and struggling, and especially now, might not have interaction with many other adults, many other people who they could ask for help, if they wanted to, or if they could. And so it's important that we all understand what mental health challenges might look like in the classroom, or in the guidance office, or in the principal's office, or wherever you're interacting with students, whether that be the virtual office or in person, because they don't necessarily look the same in all children. Next slide, please. So this is a great graphic of equality, equity, and justice, right? So many youth of color experience discrimination and chronic racism on top of the other challenges. Some of you might have heard the story of Grace, who was a 15-year-old African-American girl in Michigan whose probation was revoked, and she was put in juvenile detention for, I think, about 5 months for not completing her online schoolwork and getting up for virtual school. So Grace has a diagnosis of ADHD, but instead of kind of, thinking about those things, she was put in jail, put in prison. During the middle of a pandemic, for not getting up on time for school or not turning in some of her schoolwork. Another example in Sacramento, a 9-year-old girl was suspended for sending too many messages in the chat. And these are great examples of how bias can come into play kind of inadvertently, especially when all the things that Dana talked about are happening, right? When we're already more stressed than we normally are. All of the things that you were talking about, maybe we're getting less sleep, maybe we're managing more things, and our tolerance to kind of emotionally regulate ourselves is lower than it normally is. So we know that youth of color are disproportionately punished and even incarcerated without consideration of whether challenging behaviors are actually symptoms of untreated mental health problems. So thus, not only do they not receive the medical health treatment that they need, but they're thrown into the juvenile justice system and welfare system and all these other kind of punitive systems, which themselves increasingly exacerbate the trauma that Dana was talking about and emotional and behavioral disturbances. This creates kind of a negative cycle of trauma and unaddressed mental illness. And as you can see in this picture, equality, which is where the three people are kind of all standing on the same blocks, right? But some people are shorter than others, is not the same as equity, where everyone has what they need to get to the same place, which is not the same as justice, where the barriers aren't necessarily there in the first place. And so in education, while we haven't achieved any of these in our society, we really want to focus on how schools can promote equity and justice in mental health education and services in schools. So we talked about race, which we'll get back to, but I want to talk about some other lenses through which we can view equity work. Bullying is, a huge problem right now. It can affect everyone, and those who are bullied, those who bully, and who witness bullying are all impacted. It's linked to many negative outcomes, including mental illness, substance use, and in some cases, suicide. And in rare instances, students who are bullied may retaliate in violent ways. So bullying and harassment feed off of many forms of social inequity, including homophobia, transphobia, racism, sexism, prejudice towards ability, other things like that. And children living in poverty are often bullied for a variety of reasons as well. Receiving free or reduced lunch, having a parent, with an obvious illness or who works a lot, microaggressions and casual slurs kind of feed into it, and stereotyping reinforce a sense of disconnection and difference from peers. Cyberbullying is also a big concern. Once posted, this form of bullying is, on the internet forever, and especially right now. I know with the kids that I treat, I'm seeing a huge rise in cyberbullying, and it's really hard to do something about, I know, from the schools or any other way. Absolutely. And there's we're going to talk about that a lot, but the hoops that people have to jump through sometimes to get services are tremendous. Absolutely. So Yvette Jackson, who's someone who's a consultant that works with CEI, has encouraged educators to identify and celebrate students' strengths, as Dana mentioned, instead of focusing on differences. There's damaging neurobiological impact from otherizing, labels such as low achiever, minority, or even subgroup on learning and achievement. Marginalizing language is associated with prejudice, degradation, stereotype threat, and can incite high levels of stress in students. This stress causes the emission of cortisol, which inhibits comprehension and impairs normal brain development. So those same things that Dana was talking about, right? Once students are stressed, it's harder for them to learn because they're in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. So implementing strategies that create a shared culture of confidence, the culture that recognizes and capitalizes on the assets and values of the students, their teachers, and their communities, as well as setting high expectations for everyone, emphasizing student strengths, and offering personalized learning can reverse the negative effects of othering language. I'm just checking out what's in the chat here. There's some great discussion going on in the chat as well. Yeah, and there's a lot of things to think about as we think about bullying, as we think about discrimination in general. So that's awesome. Keep the comments coming. So why do these disparities in access and treatment occur? A lot of it has to do with stigma, right? And it can be either embarrassing or frowned upon or worse to seek mental health treatment. Some people believe that mental health isn't kind of real, and so then there's nothing to treat. Distrust in the mental health system is another that's weighted heavily towards white values and cultural norms, lack of adequate health insurance, or like people are saying, barriers to actually accessing treatment, being underinsured. And shortages of qualified service providers, particularly providers who are local and speak their language and are affordable. And then underlying assumptions can leave clinicians less able to read the severity of symptoms among people of color. And that's the same in schools, right? So like, as I said before, sometimes things look different in different students. And so if we're assuming that kind of a student acting out or talking about things in a certain way is being defiant or aggressive or something, when it really is an indication that they need some sort of support, then that leads to a different outcome. So to summarize, low income and people of color are less likely to seek treatment due to stigma and distrust, but when they do seek help, they're less likely to receive the proper diagnosis and referrals. And even if they do receive referrals, everyone is facing shortages of qualified care for children. Absolutely. So someone in the chat, I just want to point out, someone in the chat was saying that healthcare is often linked to employment. And so if people are in low wage jobs or in jobs without benefits, then that's another barrier, right, for people to receive treatment. And so again, we're seeing a lot of kids where their only potential access to services is through school. And so that's something we always want to be keeping in mind as well. So along with other people of color, Indigenous people may conceptualize mental health problems differently than mainstream Western white culture, which can have implications for assessment and diagnosis. The DSM, which is the kind of diagnosis book for mental health disorders, has been criticized for being Euro-American centric and for drawing these kind of categories in ways that don't really necessarily apply to other cultures. Medicaid funding for school-based health services can increase treatment. However, then we go back to being insured, right? And how insurance and coverage can affect students to get help inside or outside of school. So schools can help families better understand and navigate the process of enrolling in health insurance, Medicaid, Medicare, whatever it is. And that can be a huge difference in whether a student is able to receive services. And then Dana also mentioned earlier the historical trauma that some groups have faced. So years of injustice and discrimination, including violent conflict, genocide, relocation, discrimination, all sorts of really truly awful things for years and years and years have contributed to historical trauma and unresolved grief across generations. So people might be more kind of mistrusting of some of these systems with good reason. So some of our main challenges that we'll see from different populations, from Indigenous populations, we're going to see substance use, domestic violence, suicide. From Black people and African Americans, domestic violence, incarceration, PTSD, and a lot of, like I said, stigma around seeking mental health. From Latinx people, we might see language barriers. From Asian Americans, again, that stigma and shame around seeking mental health treatment. And from immigrants, potentially PTSD or migratory trauma. So different cultural groups are facing these different challenges, and we need to be aware of these as we are trying to figure out what's going on with our students and what's going on with families, especially now in this virtual world. Yeah, and I see someone in the chat saying that a lot of the places that they would refer students right now are closed due to COVID and not providing virtual or telehealth support. So there are a lot of added challenges, right, due to COVID that we are all doing our best to navigate. But it is a really tough time. So another population that faces a lot of challenges in receiving support are those that live in rural areas. More than 60% of rural Americans have mental health professional shortages. So even if they kind of overcome the stigma and do want to receive services, there's just not enough qualified professionals. And in some ways, telehealth can help with that, but that also relies on adequate connection and internet, right? And a lot of rural areas don't have those things. And so that is just something that we have to continue to think about and deal with. How far are kids coming and what do they have in their local communities? So we'll go to the next slide. And here we can just see a general distribution of mental health professionals nationally. The dark green indicates rural areas with high mental health professional shortages, and then the dark blue indicates metro areas with high shortages. So you'll notice that the West and South have significant shortages, but most of the country is experiencing some sort of shortage of mental health professionals. And then when we think about child providers, I know that those numbers really go up as well, right? There just aren't enough people who are trained and treating children. I know that in my area, I'm often turning people away just because my caseload is so high, but that's just something that we need to address. So we've seen that mental illness and suicide are increasing, but we need to understand why. And so if we step back, socioeconomic status, adverse childhood experiences, family trauma, untreated mental health conditions, increased academic pressure, overexposure to electronic devices in some ways, and inadequate amount of daytime recreation all contribute to increased anxiety, depression, and traumatic symptoms, which increases the prevalence of mental illness and death by suicide. So we're going to skip that. So just to summarize, rural, low income, and children of color consistently have less access to high quality mental health treatment, and these communities can face limited service options, lack of resources, and a variety of barriers that others do not. And I also just want to add in here that students who identify as LGBTQ, right, often present with different and higher rates of mental health challenges and higher suicide attempt rates. And so that's something that we want to be thinking about as well, right? Due to sometimes the bullying that I talked about, but for other reasons as well, especially in this time, we're seeing those numbers increase as people are just at home with their families. And so for students that live in an environment where maybe school was the supportive place for students, the affirming place for them, to be at home all the time can be a challenge. And someone was recommending The Social Dilemma on Netflix in the chat, which I know has been pretty powerful for quite a few people. So why do we as educators or people in education care so much about these things? Very simply, mental health challenges are a barrier to learning. We can't think about equity in education without addressing mental health. So if we think back to Grace, that 15-year-old girl from Michigan who was placed in juvenile detention for not completing her schoolwork, it's easy to see how mental health challenges and the way we handle them in the schooling system impact education outcomes. Why not consider as the first thought for Grace, who has a diagnosis of ADHD already, that like many of our children since shelter in place started, that she might be depressed, instead of assuming that she's being willfully defiant as our first thought, right? Why not consider as the first thought for that 9-year-old girl in Sacramento who was suspended for sending too many messages in the chat, that like many of our children since shelter in place started, she might be having trouble managing anxiety or managing ADHD symptoms in this virtual world. How does that change the response then to the actions as they come up? So we'll go to the next slide. We are getting some awesome recommendations in the chat as well. So we also know that COVID-19 has brought increased stress, anxiety, and uncertainty about the future for all of us, right? And unfortunately, it is increasing existing inequalities. People of color and those living in poverty are more likely to lose income or a job, and thus their health care, as we mentioned earlier, and they're more likely to be working in an essential job at higher risk of infection. So these individuals are less likely then to have high quality health insurance or paid time off, and are more likely to have pre-existing health conditions, which can make coronavirus up to 10 times more deadly. So studies have shown that a disproportionate number of different populations of color are accounting for diagnoses, and that more than half of COVID deaths nationally can be attributed to people of color. And then, sorry, almost there. With increased parental stress, there are also concerns of increased ACEs, then, right, those adverse childhood experiences. And youth have very few options to get away from those environments if they are potentially traumatic in some ways. So depression among teens may increase as a result of the physical distancing, missed life events, just kind of lack of those sometimes meaningful connections, which is concerning in terms of the risk of teen suicide. With loss of income and health coverage, families are less able to access quality mental health treatment, and So it's so important that we are thinking about those protective factors as a way that we can help teens deal with COVID-19. And as Dana mentioned earlier, one of the biggest protective factors for adverse childhood experiences is that they have a caring adult. And sometimes that is, the teacher or the school counselor or someone in the school system. A caring adult who they feel like cares about them can be a huge protective factor against developing traumatic symptoms. Absolutely. So then we think about, once we kind of understand the problem, what do we do from here? How do we reduce disparities? So not sure what happened.
Sorry, I'm not sure what happened. 1 second.
That's okay. Taking a pause. So we got some stuff in the chat about kids being, yeah, exactly. Administration and discipline need to work together with mental health services, something that McCourt and Cumberland does well. Cindy, thanks. So that's absolutely true. That's actually one of the first recommendations, is to look at policies. Dana, do you want me to keep going, or should we pause and take a 60-second break, get up and stretch if you need to?
Is that where we are?
Yeah, it is where we are.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
And what?
Okay.
We could go ahead and take a longer break, or would you prefer to just keep going and then maybe take a break before my last hour? What do you think, Dana?
Up to, I guess now would be at the halfway point, so kind of makes sense right now to take a little break.
Okay.
Okay. Leave your screen on and just come back and say 5 minutes, okay?
All right. So as I was saying, we kind of talked about the landscape, gave a really quick run through, and now we're going to spend some time talking about what we can do, how we can make things better for our school communities. So the first thing, as someone was kind of alluding to in the chat, it's so important that we're looking at the data and reviewing policies. We can utilize data from previous years on school suspensions, expulsions, and other punishments, as well as who is getting rewarded and recognized, to determine how different groups are being seen in the school community. In addition to specifically collected data, schools can assist teachers and other staff in examining school policies and think through when, where, and why they might bring about different results for different students. And there are some resources linked here on where to start. There's a lot of good work by Dr. Monique Morris, who wrote the book Push Out: The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. And there's also a really good documentary by the same name, which offers a number of helpful resources on the website. And then organizations like Dignity in Schools and Let Her Learn provide model codes and policies to reduce to reduce kind of racism bias or other sorts of bias, and eliminate discriminatory policies in schools. And then last, as we think about looking at data and reviewing policies, it's so important that we're bringing in experiences from a diverse group of students, alumni, and families to understand the school climate and how policies are impacting people and how they're perceived. So the next thing is to employ a diverse workforce, right? So fairly simply, hire and maintain a diverse staff. So we know that hiring a diverse staff allows students to develop strong relationships with people who look like them or who grew up like them, which is so important. A student's comfort in asking for help relies so heavily on the relationship. Respect, shared trust, and open communication are so important, and having a diverse workforce makes students more likely to seek out assistance. We know from preliminary research that students are more likely to graduate from high school, especially students of color are more likely to graduate from high school and to enroll in college when they have at least one teacher in elementary school, the first kind of K through 3 grades, that looks like them. And researchers attribute that to just kind of positive educational results resulting from higher expectations and more positive self-perceptions and attitudes towards education, and the benefits of having a role model that students can see themselves reflected in. So we ask ourselves, how many people of color are on school staff, how many people who identify as LGBTQ from immigrant or low income backgrounds, and how many of those people are in leadership positions in school situations. And then it's so important that schools are creating space to address conscious and unconscious bias, right? And so the first thing that we just kind of need to do when we're thinking about addressing bias is to recognize that we all have biases. We have grown up in different environments, we have seen different things as what is normal or normative, and we have to actively work to do something about that. So a really good way to do that is to increase the diversity of sources for information and teaching materials, the things that we are consuming, to identify vulnerable decision points, which I'll talk about in a second. And then also, it's so important that we are making addressing bias a consistent process. So we know from the research that if we do kind of, a professional development or something on addressing bias, those effects begin to fade over time. And so they consistently need to be brought up kind of to the forefront of people's minds to make sure that we are aware of what's happening. So again, we all have biases, but the trouble is acting on those biases in ways that are unfair and prejudicial. And so we know that in general, implicit bias, those unconscious biases, tend to affect decisions that involve more uncertainty, ambiguity, or discretion. Those are called vulnerable decision points. And there's a lot of things then that also impact those when we have to very quickly take context into account, which goes back to what we think is normal and what we think is different. So that might be a teacher decision to refer someone to the office, or an administrator decision to suspend someone, or to otherwise kind of, have some sort of punishment towards students. Those all increase the likelihood of bias affecting discipline decisions and making the biggest impact. So those vulnerable decision points are really the ones that we want to focus on as we think about policies and as we think about changing. And we know they're impacted by a number of things that really make a lot of sense, right? Like things like time of day, disparate punishment goes up in schools right after lunch or near the end of the day when people are tired. It depends on the time of year. There's more disparate punishment at the end of the school year when teachers are more likely to be stressed, or, we don't really know how this is impacted by coronavirus, but generally when teachers are more stressed, those things come into play, or even location when we're physically at school. So outside of the classroom, where adults are less likely to have an intimate relationship with a student, they're less likely to know the student that they're talking to. That's a place where bias is more likely to occur and impact punishment and decision making. So during those vulnerable decision points, it is so important that we wait an extra second. One of my professors in grad school used to always say that you're not responsible for your first thought, but you are responsible for your second and third thought and what you do with those thoughts, right? So it's so important that we're taking a deep breath and coming from a place of reasoned compassion instead of gut instinct. Teachers and other school personnel can ask yourselves, are there other ways to view this situation? So if we think about Grace, right? Is she being willfully defiant, or is she struggling in some other way? Is something else going on here? Is the fight or flight triggered in some way from a student who may have been traumatized? Would I be reacting the same way if this were a different student? What might be causing a student to act this way? And just taking that extra second to take a deep breath, regulate our own emotional response, because again, we are all most of us are super stressed right now, pretty stressed, right? Was the standard response. Those things have a huge impact on how we respond differently to different students. Awesome. Teaching tolerance is a great resource for some of these things as well. So our next suggestion is to invest in culturally sensitive services. Collectively, we need to call for a better understanding of treatment of mental health care within our educational system. One of the first things schools can do is to develop a compassionate and culturally sensitive mental health program that includes a program for teachers, families, and students. Because as Dana said, we all could use some extra mental health support right now, right? And we are at our best when we are mentally healthy, and that means that we are able then to support students and families in the way that they need. So providing quality education to improve mental health literacy is super helpful, including identifying risk factors and symptoms of mental illness, as well as the benefits of addressing issues early. So sometimes people just don't know, right, what is happening or what it looks like. I'm starting to feel different. I'm starting to, it's harder for me to get out of bed. I'm feeling less motivated. I'm feeling more tired. I'm having these things happen, but I don't have a name for it. I don't really know what's going on. And so oftentimes students just think that they are failing, right? And so talking about what these things look like, talking about what depressive symptoms might look like, anxiety, or using other words, but kind of just normalizing that conversation is so helpful for students and for families in recognizing, oh, there's something going on here, and there are things that can help me. Research has shown that Latinx parents often stress the importance of behavior and academics within education, and they may assume the educational system is addressing children's behavioral needs without the need of additional services. And so helping families to understand what schools do and what schools can do, and when they might need extra support from outside sources is also super, super important. And that means for schools, identifying and addressing harmful assumptions and providing support and education around legal and linguistic barriers for people. So we already talked about this, but I also just put it in here because it's so important. Supporting and empowering teachers. Teachers are often the person that students will kind of say something to if they're going to say something, right? And so making sure that teachers know what to look for is super, super important right now, especially in this virtual world. And we do have a number of resources on the Center for Educational Improvement website about identifying mental health challenges and back to school after COVID that are really helpful. Also, the National Association of School Psychologists has a lot of good articles on what to look for in different age groups as it relates to potentially normative versus more concerning behavior, especially right now when students are hearing so much about death and dying and people getting sick and having all of these extra anxieties coming up. And then schools are a huge way that students reduce stigma. So in addition to educating school communities on mental illness, a major focus needs to be on reducing stigma around mental health. This can be done through anti-stigma campaigns within schools and communities, as well as just regular education and authentic discussion. And this is a great example. Dior Vargas grew up in New York and dealt with major depressive disorder. And in order to combat the stigma and loneliness that she faced, she developed a mental illness photo project where people shared their photos of themselves and identified the mental health issue that they face. Both schools and parents can provide support by openly discussing mental health and creating a safe space for youth to feel comfortable sharing. So putting names and faces to these things, right, can very much help people to feel more comfortable in sharing. And then it's so important that we are creating culturally competent curriculum. So evaluating the curriculum to see how many books are written by or feature main characters of color, or people who are LGBTQ, or people who come from different backgrounds is really, really important. It's so important that we're regularly seeing ourselves represented in this text. Is the story that we are telling or the books that we are choosing always told from the perspective of the dominant group or the victim? or the victor, or are there other perspectives being represented in those stories? When discussing historical injustices, we need to be tracing the effects of the discrimination and oppression to the ancestors of those who experienced inequity. So it's not necessarily just that something happened 100 or 200 or 300 years ago, but that these things continue to impact people today. Right. So as we think about Indigenous communities, as we think about Black communities, as we think about so many different people, there are still impacts to some of the decisions that were made and the actions that were carried out today. And that is really important, that it's not just in something that happened a long time ago that we don't need to be thinking about, but they are still impactful. And then celebrate different cultures and customs. So having projects about family history, a culture fair, share different celebrations, things that are allow students and families to highlight in a positive way those strengths, those things that they are bringing to the community that really are make the community so special. And then another great tool is restorative justice. So most of you all have heard about probably the school to prison pipeline. We gave some examples where schools are becoming pathways to incarceration rather than opportunity for some students. Zero tolerance discipline practices have increased students' risk of low achievement and arrest, dropout, and they disproportionately penalize marginalized groups, students of color, low-income students, special education students, students who identify as LGBTQ. So restorative justice focuses on building healthy relationships, repairing harm, empowering youth, and promoting justice and equity. It encourages students to explore the reasons and effects for their offenses, which leads to deeper and more meaningful interactions and discussions. And healing is a core tenet. So the person who was harmed feels heard, and the perpetrator gains empathy and understands the underlying reasons for the conflict. And so 3 shifts towards restorative schools, just in case anyone can't read that. It goes from efforts to suppress misbehavior, which is a word we don't really use, but misbehavior based on the view that it's evidence of failing students or a classroom, to recognizing and using the inherent value of behavior as an opportunity for social and emotional learning. It goes from authority-driven disciplinary action that focuses on the students identifying certain students, to restorative circles that bring together everyone who is most immediately affected. And it goes from punishment and exclusion to dialogue leading to understanding and action to set things right and repair and restore those relationships. And another example, again from Montgomery County Public Schools, they began practicing restorative justice. They held workshops for parents to teach them about restorative justice, what it entails, some exercises from their teacher training and ways parents can advocate for their children. And the goal here was to build community, promote self-care, and promote conflict resolution. And circle discussions bring students together and create an open space to have honest discussions and build relationships. So in Montgomery County, they provided great resources on their website and include sample discussion guides for circle discussions. So if that's something that people are interested in, you can check out their website for more information and for a framework to utilize some of these things. And these can be employed virtually and might honestly be, there's not a lot that we can do kind of over the screen when an incident is happening, but this is a great way to kind of center the student and bring them back to the present and bring the whole group back to the present through something like these circles. Next slide, please. And then it's so important that we are incorporating evidence-based interventions. So I'm just highlighting 2 here, but there's quite a few. I really like these because they're pretty simple. The first is the empathic discipline intervention, which comes from Stanford University, as well as researchers from University of California, Berkeley. So this was a study where they found that a short empathic discipline intervention halved the number of students who are getting suspended in an academic year. by helping to shift the teacher mindset about the importance of the student-teacher relationship before imposing consequences. So all it was teachers read a short article about having an empathic mindset and what that means. And then they went and reviewed records and incidents and reflected on how they might discipline or do something else with those students after the fact. And just having that shift towards being empathic, remembering the importance of a relationship with the student led to suspensions being cut in half for the entire school year. And then the second one is the WISE feedback intervention, which is also from Stanford. And it's really quick, right? So this one just says that it encourages teachers to begin feedback with, I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations and I know that you can reach them. So for students, this indicates that a teacher has a positive regard for them and believes in them. And what researchers found was that students often don't know why their work is being criticized. And especially if they're of color, or if they come from a background where parents don't have high levels of education, they fear that their teachers are giving negative feedback because of negative stereotypes about them. Maybe that say that Black children are not smart or good at school or things like that. And so when teachers just simply addressed it, I'm giving you this feedback because I have high expectations for you. When their fears were addressed, they were better able to focus on their schoolwork and were more likely to turn in higher quality work. So those are just two really, really quick examples, right? But kind of easy shifts to make that had a huge impact on student success. And then last, it's just really important that we are helping students to understand discrimination, racism, and injustice. And so once we've kind of done the work at the school level to combat our own bias, once we've put in place some of these interventions, then we need to be doing this in the classroom with students as well. And so we can have open dialogues about systemic injustices that prevent certain groups of people from achieving the same level of success, recognizing that those barriers do exist. We can have students bring in a news story about inequity, discuss how the wrong was righted, if it's been righted, or discuss what someone could do to help. Bring in speakers for all school assemblies that have lived experience in overcoming injustice in different ways, and invite students to share their family's history as it relates to equity. And Dana was sharing that growth mindset is feedback is similar to WISE feedback, and that's so true, right? The feedback and how we're wording it is so important for students to help them be successful. So those are some ways that we can think about beginning to address some of the inequity in schools. And now I think I'm turning it over to Dr. Mason.
Thank you, Kayla. So, wow, my head is spinning a little, and I've heard this many, many times. So I'm thinking, I just want to take a couple seconds to begin with, just to pause for you to reflect on what you've heard and think about everything that was just presented about equity and about social emotional learning, mindfulness, the neurobiology of trauma. So many techniques, so many resources. As you take a couple moments, you might turn to the paper you have beside you, jot down a couple of notes that come to mind. One of the techniques we can use when we start to feel that overload in our brain is to pause a bit. Okay, so what's a core learning team? With our process, and this is the process that Michelle Rivers Murphy and Jill Flanders, two of our co-facilitators, and I used during the early years when we were piloting our work. This process continues to be used with schools in New England and elsewhere, the schools that are using our mindfulness practices, techniques. Michelle and I have written a couple books related to this, so that there are additional resources available to help you. So we start with an awareness of needs, and we're going to give you some data today to help you understand more about the needs. We help you form core learning teams. We'll go over the assessments, and then there's training that's happening with you over a period of time. And neurobiology of trauma is often one of the very first things we talk about. Again, because we find that many times teachers don't have that background. And it's kind of amazing to me. You think about kids who are struggling academically. And what have we done for years and years and years? We focused more on academics, right? Let's get a little more math drill. Let's make sure that you spend enough time. Remember those common core years, math and reading. We got to make sure we have a lot of that. Well, the new research out on neuroscience, new for about the last 10 years at least, shows that sometimes if you help to relieve the stress with the brain, if you kind of free up those brain cells so that the prefrontal cortex is more active, that in fact, you can help increase academic learning. Isn't that amazing? Who would have thought, right? That rather than turning to books or more paperwork, that what we could do is just provide some space for learning. But that really does help. And it's a good stress reliever for you and for students. So we're going to, so just keep that in mind when you think about what you might do. And then we're going to show you some data that might help you form a vision. Another thing that I do a lot of work with is visioning. And we're thinking about what's our vision for the future? What's going to happen when this pandemic is over? What kind of schools are we going to have? Will they be hybrid? And we can't imagine going back to what way things were. But we can use this data, the data we're going to show you today, and the processes we have to help inform that visioning. Okay, next slide. So the second step was to form a core learning team. The concept of a core learning team comes from the work of Peter Senge, a professor at MIT, a brilliant strategist who's written a lot about learning organizations that keep evolving and learning. And Dr. Senge likes to talk about having them learn in a natural, almost organic way. So you try to think about simple solutions that really relate to things that seem natural rather than artificial. Restorative justice, restorative practices, those are two good practices that really do relate to a more natural way of handling things rather than some artificial punitive discipline imposed from the outside. Okay. So he talks about core learning organizations. Michelle and I, along with Yvette Jackson, have talked about core learning teams. And this is the work now that we're doing with the CTLC in New England and with Rachel and Lisa and others. And we say that basically you want a team that maybe will have 3 paraprofessionals, 3 teachers, program directors, mental health providers, and a principal, assistant principal, or an administrator. So that's the core. Can you go back one more time? With that core, you have a small group that can help be a steering team. It can guide what you're doing in your schools. Now, this team can be bigger, or you could have several in your school. Those are decisions to be made. And maybe after our experiences today, you'll have a better idea of what you might do. Okay. So in New England, when we had early discussions about what should be done, we found that when kids were emotionally dysregulated, that took a huge amount of time away from teaching and learning. That there were fears sometimes for the general safety of the staff and students, particularly when in fact there was violence involved and repeated incidents and perhaps even escalating incidents. And that there were really limitations of behavioral expectations and a model of discipline and follow through. So we knew that these old school way of doing things needed to be replaced with something, again, that's more natural and something that, in fact, you can work with a small team to decide what to do. So it's an empowerment process we're using as well. We're not going to come in, we don't expect the the results we give you will be, just do it this way. There's a lot of flexibility. And I think it's really important for you to know about that flexibility and know about your individual circumstances. Okay, next slide. So this is kind of the way the core learning teams work. You're going to think about the composition, who will be on them, what will be the purpose, and in general, the way we're recommending them, the purpose will be to look at the results you get from the test that we're going to show you in a minute and think about what you want to do. What do you want to implement with students, with your classrooms? And many, many, many times you get better results if it's more than one teacher doing it. You know, that whole consistency of your rules, your regulations in the school is important. It's important for youth to have that consistency across grade levels. However, we want this team to be empowered to make decisions. Again, rather than someone from the outside coming. So there's some planning. We'd like you to think about professional development because, you know, some things you could just implement by, oh yeah, you go to the link and you say, okay, we can do it. And your core learning team meets kind of like a PLC, right? Professional learning community makes a decision, fine. That works. But sometimes it's really good to have some professional development. Maybe go through some exercises with someone who's facilitated this before. And then you decide on interventions. The process we use with this is on the right. Looking at the data from our SCATE, the charts, and then there's 2 levels of recommendations we have. The first go around, and we're abbreviating everything we're doing with you today. The first go around is recommendations. So you get some recommendations, you're going to look at them and say, okay, now what do we do? What do we like? Well, what have we done before? What looks appealing? What do we need to learn about? And then you take a breath, maybe the next week come back, and before you make your final decision, look at an action guide. The action guide gives you more depth. If you were outside of New England, you'd be buying these packages. The recommendations would be more the basic level. The action guides would be the premium. So we have 2 levels of possible things to implement. The action guides have more details in terms of the professional development and also in terms of the hyperlinks, the number of recommendations. So next slide, we're going to go to the recommendations and action guides. You got data packages earlier. We are going to go into breakout rooms in just a couple of minutes. And in those breakout rooms, there will be a data lead from your school. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We met early last week with the data leads, a tremendous group of people with a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge about the Cumberland School District, and anyway, ability, I think, to work with your teams. And for what we're doing today, we're going to break out by school. So that means instead of just a small core learning teams, you might have 100 people even in a room. That's okay, because this is going to give you a taste of what you can do later. So when you get into that breakout room, you will look at your school's scores. You'll compare them to the national data. You'll look at the variations at the high and low. And you've done similar work with other sorts of data before. Very similar even to academic achievement, right? And there will be some data filtering where you can look at different subgroups. And here's someone who said they don't have a data package. We will do some double checking. You don't absolutely need that package to go through the process because we're going to have 2 leaders in each group, the data lead from the school and one of our team members. So either Dana, Kayla, me, Ingrid, or Jill Flanders or Michelle Rivers Murphy, who I introduced earlier, will be in those rooms together. They're going to lead you through a process. And I think you'll gain something even from listening and being a part of that process. But ideally, you'll have the data package. Okay, next slide. So just to give you an example. So here's data for Cumberland. This is for the whole school. You're going to have data for your school. So your data will be only for your school, and you'll be able to look at your school results. Okay, so I think I've explained a lot of that. Go to the next slide. And I've talked about the school data lead. The data lead is really going to help us look at the data recommendations. Our facilitators are going to be there to help facilitate the process. And together, these two leaders should be able to help with the dialogue and discussion that will cover some of the things we just talked about. Okay, so there is a facilitator's guide. The co-leaders have that. They'll be able to share that with you later if you have any questions. But this will help them with the process we have. So you're going to get your SK data. You're going to look at it. You're going to look at the recommendations. You're going to weigh alternatives. And then we'll come back. And we have, I think probably we'll break out for, say, let's do like 17 minutes, okay? So a couple minutes to make sure everybody gets to your room. We'll convene, go through the first 3 or 4 steps, and then come back to the large group. And I think there's something special that's happening with the breakout room. Ingrid, would you like to share the process?
Yes, so participants from Cumberland Hill, Garvin, JLMMS, and NCMS will have their breakout sessions at a new link that I'm sharing in the chat box here. So if you're from those schools, you'll disconnect from this meeting and go to the link shared, and I will meet you there.
Okay, let's just repeat that. If you're from one of those 4 schools, you go to that link. We'll come back in about 17 minutes. If you have any questions during this process, you can reach out to either Dana or Ingrid. They're going to help make sure that you get to the right room.
And I'm going to start the breakout sessions here now. So you'll be sent to your room now, and Dana will be your host. And then I will open up the next room.
Okay, thank you.